Thank you, guys. I really appreciate everybody joining us today. On behalf of the National Juvenile Justice Network, I just want to say that we're excited to have you. This webinar is on bringing kids home, lessons learned from the decarceration efforts during the pandemic. And so we have some really awesome NJJN members who've been doing fierce advocacy all around the country over the past year and a few more months now, really to make sure kids are serviced at home and out of facilities. But just before we get started, a few housekeeping items. We are recording today's webinar. So for those who want to share it, or if you registered but are unable to attend the full thing, we'll be sure to share the recording with everyone. And just given the number of attendees, it looks like pretty much folks are familiar with Zoom webinars at this point. But we just ask, if you're not speaking, if you could please turn off your cameras and mute yourself. We will have time for question and answers at the end. But if you would like during the webinar, if something comes up, please put it in the chat box and we can be sure to get to questions at the end. And that way, if we aren't able to get through all the questions, we can come back and be sure to respond to you after the webinar is over. And then we'll just say one other thing in terms of optimal viewing experience. Folks are familiar with Zoom, but there's the ability to just do the speaker view. And so for this webinar, just given the number of panelists, it's probably going to yield the best experience for you. So with that, we'll jump right to it. So we have a really fantastic panel today. We've been working with member organizations from Maryland, North Carolina, Minnesota, New York, and Pennsylvania for over a year now. And they've really been pushing to get young people home during COVID and make sure that young people aren't being funneled through the justice system during this pandemic. And there's obviously a lot of lessons learned for the work moving forward. So we're excited to have them. I'll let each organization introduce their staff and sort of talk a little bit about their work, and then we'll hop into questions. So I will start with you, Taz, in Maryland. If you could just share a little bit or introduce yourself and share a little bit about the work and what you guys have accomplished over the last year.
Cool. Hey, folks. So I'm going to do this. My name is Martez or Taz Gaines. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the project coordinator of 24 and None, housed in the Maryland Office of the Public Defender. We are a group of young folks fighting for a Maryland where all youth have 24 hours of freedom and 0 hours of lockup. We are based on the land of the Piscataway, Susquehanna, and Nanticoke folks across Maryland. And our decarceration efforts really have been to continue and sort of bring light to the decarceration efforts of the Office of the Public Defender. So there have been tons and tons of litigation and representation from our public defenders to make sure that our young folks, again, weren't being put into the risk of COVID because they were in the close quarters inside of prisons, right? And so we have seen these decarceration efforts lead really to our jails like being empty, right? Like having a lot less people than they've had in the past. And so hopefully we are able to continue that work as this year has really been a building year for us. We were just started in last August, getting our members in last October. And so, yeah, since we've been really building and trying to support the work of the Office of the Public Defender. That's us at 24 and None.
Thanks. And Dawn, do you want to share a little bit about the work that's been happening in North Carolina?
Sure. My name is Attorney Dawn Blagrove. I am the Executive Director of Emancipate NC. We are an organization that is committed to ending mass incarceration and systemic and institutional racism. So we have done a lot, not as much as we hoped to have done because of COVID, but certainly some pretty big accomplishments. We were able to do some really good work in Nash and Wilson counties around cite and release and school resource officers and the impact of the carceral system on children who are involved, whether they be directly involved or collaterally involved because of parents. We also had some really terrific interns that did some really great community educating. We were able to partner with some local HBCUs and get some Black Lives Matters murals done on a campus here. We had a Justice League that was made up of lots of adults and children who were directly impacted by the carceral system in one way or another. And they were given a slew of various trainings so that they could become leaders and advocates in their communities. As a result, many of them did advocacy work around the Racial Justice Task Force that was put together here in North Carolina by Governor Cooper, advocating to get rid of school resource officers. And then we also had them just using their voices in some narrative building. And we had several of our Justice League fellows and several of our young folks who wrote essays about their experiences, both protesting and then also their experiences inside of the carceral system and what that looked like. So we're really, really happy about the work that we have been able to do and excited about what we can do moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah, you guys have really accomplished a lot over the last year. And Malika in Minnesota, Legal Rights Center.
Thanks, Allison. Good afternoon, y'all. My name is Malika Avon. I use she, her pronouns. I work at the Legal Rights Center. We are a community-driven nonprofit law firm serving adults and young people in Hennepin County, which is where Minneapolis is. This has been quite a year to be in Minneapolis, to be working with youth, to be a community-driven organization on the front lines of a movement for justice. And a lot of this really kicked off for us at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic last year. Since the beginning, our organization and our coalition in Minnesota of community members and organizations fighting for youth justice have been asking and elevating and demanding that young people in facilities have all of the protections that could be afforded while they're there, and ultimately focused on trying to get young people out of facilities during this pandemic. So from the beginning of the pandemic, we came together as a community coalition and wrote a demand letter, requested meetings and had meetings with leaders in our State Department of Corrections, as well as our local county Department of Corrections and Community Rehabilitation, and really focused our demands on decarceration, sending young people home, as well as stopping that new admissions of young people into facilities, making sure that the facilities, young people who had to remain in facilities had both like the health conditions that were required and also humane during this pandemic, but also access to their families, education. We did a lot of pushes to ensure that young people had access to technology while inside of facilities so that they could be in contact with their loved ones, and really demanding transparency from our system stakeholders so that community members and loved ones on the outside knew how many young people in facilities were being tested on a regular basis, how many were contracting the virus, and what the plans were in place to keep young people safe. So it's been a tough year. We did see our youth justice system shrink in the numbers of young people who were in facilities as a result of the pandemic and the advocacy of community members. And we continue to push and are right now in this interesting place where we're trying to put brakes on a system that's trying to rev up back to normal, doing our best to make the case for continued system prioritization of decarceration.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's awesome to see what's happened in Minnesota over the last year, and I know you guys are still building. So thanks for joining us. And Luis in New York, you want to talk about the work of the Gathering for Justice?
Yes, absolutely. Well, pleasure to be on with you all. My name is Luis Hernandez. I'm the National Director of Youth Campaigns and Leadership here at the Gathering for Justice, based out of our New York office. And so just to talk a little bit about our work, close to the gathering's heart is our mission to end child incarceration. And so our decarceration efforts were focused on uprooting the systems that land young people in prisons, jails, and detention centers from the offset. And so we organized young people from across New York City and state to target the school to prison pipeline, and are actively fighting back against our county, who has failed to meet the students' demand for police-free schools. We leveraged the pandemic as an opportunity to get young people out of jail, because I think at the heart of it, what we know is that young people weren't sentenced to death by a deadly pandemic, and prisons, detention centers, and juvenile facilities across the state of New York failed to actively respond to the coronavirus pandemic from the offset. And so working with re-entry organizations as young people were released from these detention centers, we actively supported their integration, providing direct aid. And so we launched what was initially just a mutual aid sort of support to young people who are systems impacted, and what grew into the Community Relief Fund, which is now a part of the Gathering's ongoing programming, which supports directly impacted young people who have recently been released from foster care, a juvenile facility, or had a parent who was recently released and are in need of support. And so as we sort of did that work around reentry and really centering youth leadership, what we know is that there was also really a breaking and an uprising around the country. And so we were actively engaged in the local protesting efforts, working with young people who were on the ground, actively pushing for things like the right to remain silent, right? What we know is that in the Constitution, young people should already be afforded procedural safeguards, should already have access to be able to really just have basic rights as anyone else would. But in New York and a lot of states across the country, young people do not have the right to remain silent. Oftentimes they're tricked into false confessions or false procedural things that eventually land young people into prisons, jails, and detention centers. A story that highlights this like no other is that of the Central Park Five. And so we worked with an incredible coalition in New York to advance the Right to Remain Silent campaign. We're coming to a legislative close in New York, and so nothing is promising, but what we know is that if nothing happens this legislative session, New York now has the capacity and the power pushing behind this initiative. And so I won't say much more, but there was a lot of work that happened regardless of the pandemic. I think like many of the other partners that spoke, there was so much that happened because of COVID-19, but we really just leveraged the pandemic as a tool to decarcerate and specifically get young people out in a timely manner.
Thanks, Luis. I know we have a bunch of folks on from Pennsylvania. I'm not sure who wants to sort of tell the Pennsylvania story or start, but I saw Malik on, so I'll call you out and you can refer to others.
Thank you, Allison. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Malik Pickett. I'm a staff attorney at Juvenile Law Center, appearing here on behalf of Juvenile Law Center, the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project, and the Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project. We were all co-grantees, and we came together. Some of our major goals for these grant funds were to reform the juvenile justice system by divesting from incarceration and reinvesting in communities. And we really leveraged the COVID-19 pandemic as an illustration of why those reforms were necessary. And we also wanted to end the practice of trying youth as adults and in turn incarcerating youth in adult jails. And so we really leveraged the Pennsylvania Juvenile Justice Task Force process to accomplish those goals. At the end of 2019, the governor of Pennsylvania, Governor Wolf, appointed a juvenile justice task force, which was made up of 30 juvenile justice stakeholders from around the state that were tasked with coming together to study Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system and then to create reforms that are going to be encompassed within the final report, and then to take those recommendations for reform to the legislature to hopefully be introduced. So we really wanted to leverage that process. And so part and parcel of our work, one of the things that we did was we were able to organize free our youth action and call-in days, which were meant to put direct pressure on judicial leadership and district attorneys' offices to release more youth during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we also collaborated with the Village and other national and local organizations to create the Care Not Control campaign, which was launched as a statewide campaign to influence the task force. And so part of our work as in the collaboration on the Care Not Control campaign was that we created a set of public demands and a petition to support our demands, which has nearly 900 signatories. Just put a plug in here that if you guys are interested, you can sign up. I think there'll be some information in the chat from my wonderful co-grantees. We also worked with young people to develop and present testimonials to the task force. We also organized the Care Not Control virtual town hall that had over 200 attendees, including 17 task force members. And at the town hall, there were youth and families who gave testimony and talked about how they were directly impacted by Pennsylvania's adult and juvenile justice systems and presented powerful testimony. And finally, another thing that we did was that all the grantee organizations wrote letters commenting on the draft recommendations that the task force was considering including in their final report, and urging them to keep the recommendation strong amidst a lot of influence from opposing stakeholders. So those are just a few of the things that we did. So thank you.
Thanks, Malik. And as I listen to folks talk, right, there is a ton of strategies that folks use, and a lot of the things, sort of common themes that popped up were youth organizing, sort of policy advocacy and traditional policy advocacy. There are these task forces in Maryland, task forces in Pennsylvania, letter writing campaigns. So if we could just hear from folks and hear really what were the most successful advocacy strategies in terms of getting kids home. And maybe we can start with Maryland again.
Yeah, again, I think I have to send a lot of love and a lot of thanks to the folks, our public defenders. A lot of these folks are bringing the information to, again, our judges to let them know, right? Like, we need to get our youth out of jails, right? It is not a safe place ever, but especially not during the pandemic. I think other strategies that we have found successful, again, along this lines of legislation, but it really is allowing folks to tell their story through whatever means, right? And so we did have one of our participants to write and deliver their testimony in front of our house. We also had folks to practice their testimonies, even if they didn't get to deliver them yet. And so that's been pretty fun, and allowing, again, folks to tell their stories. We've also plugged into some of the other work and some of the other coalitions that are happening across the state, realizing that we are new in the advocacy scene in across Maryland, but there are tons of other coalitions that have been doing work, especially around removing school police and things like that, and trying to do, again, the preventative measures so that we are like not filling up our jails in the first place, right? And so I think a lot of that work really has been plugging into the work that's already going on. And folks have been like really gracious and allowing us to be, to have the like breadth and freedom to learn, like as we are new in this process and in this advocacy scene together. And so I think that has been really successful for us, again, which is really just plugging into the work that is existing.
Thank you so much, Taz. And Don, in North Carolina, I know you guys have tried a couple different things. What did you find most successful?
So some of the things that we found most successful was definitely the narrative shifting. North Carolina is a tough state to actually get wins in because of our political makeup. I'll leave it at that. But I was really proud, and I think some of the really strong advocacy work that our folks did and our juveniles did was around the advocacy with the task force. They were received very, very well there. We got lots of traction with the pieces that some of our Justice League fellows were able to write, that we were able to produce on our blog and were picked up with other media outlets. So that had really good legs. And I think it was transformative in nature as the way people think about these issues and the role that they think that young people should play in advocating for the kind of policy change that we're working on. So those were some areas that we saw that were really, really successful. In North Carolina, some of our challenges were definitely decarceration, and not so much because of a lack of effort. It's just that the juvenile system in North Carolina is really cloaked in a lot of secrecy. And so it is very difficult for advocates to get a foothold inside of our juvenile detention centers to really be able to advocate effectively for youth, and for youth to be able to advocate for each other and for themselves. So lack of access, I think, would be one of our biggest issues. Lack of transparency and lack of access, for sure. And some of our bigger successes were definitely the face-to-face advocacy or Zoom to Zoom advocacy that we were able to do around elevating the issues and the direct impacts of having school resource officers, of charging 16 and 17-year-olds as adults for higher felony crimes, what that looks like, having our kids involved in and at the table, making space for them at the table for those kinds of strategy and advocacy discussions seem to be really impactful.
Thanks, Dawn. I sort of heard from a bunch of folks around this youth power building and how that's been really successful in moving the needle. Malika, I wonder what was most successful in Minneapolis, if you could speak a little.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of similar things to what other folks have shared. In addition to a way that we attacked one of the issues that Dawn was just speaking about, one of our most successful strategies was really like honing in on the statutory authority of different agencies within our state and county run system. So in Minnesota, we have a county operated youth justice system with some oversight by our State Department of Corrections. And so one of the main issues that we brought forward in our first demands around COVID was to ensure that young people still had visitation access to their families using technology, given that most of the facilities were on shutdown in the early days. And as often happens in our advocacy, it felt a little bit that we were hearing, the same answer from different system stakeholders, which was that it was someone else's oversight or someone else's responsibility to handle that challenge. And so a big strategy of ours was really to get down into the rules and licensing handbooks to see, the Department of Corrections has this responsibility and the county has this one. And so you can and need to exercise your power in this way. And this person then has to respond. So that was one strategy that definitely worked for us. And then in addition to what has also been shared, having a youth fellowship and working with young people to hone in on their organizing and advocacy skills, helping them craft narratives and uplift the voices of young people in this work has been super critical for us, especially as young people in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis and St. Paul have really been on the front lines of fights for justice in the last year, as they always have been historically as well. But especially in this year, there feels like there's been a renewed interest in hearing in the voices of young people, especially young people with specific visions. And so working with the young people who are directly impacted by the system and helping uplift their urgent care for their friends and family members who were still inside facilities, as well as, broader transformative changes in the youth justice system have been really important for us.
Thank you. That's really great insight into how to move the needle when you don't necessarily have that access. Luis, do you want to talk about the work in New York City and sort of what was most successful there?
Yeah, I think one, really just leaning on non-traditional partners. And so part of what we sort of tapped into was some of our faith leaders. What were some of the sort of youth empowerment groups who weren't necessarily involved in advocacy or in decarceration efforts, but really had their heart centered on the needs of young people, right? And so we really leveraged those non-traditional partners in our work here in New York, asked them to sign off on letters, asked them to sort of be the spokespeople in certain things. I think New York, as many people know, has a culture of organizing and advocacy. And oftentimes when it's the same person sounding the same alarm every year, there's not really any needle pushed or moved. There's no real pressure that these legislators feel to act. And so leaning on these non-traditional partners, leaning on the young people, specifically having them meet and have information sessions with representatives that serve them, right? Folks, their direct constituents, folks in their districts, was important, an important part of our strategy here in New York. Understanding that there's one assessment that we have when they hear from an organizer, an activist, or an organization that does decarceration work, but it's a different sort of pressure when you hear directly from a young person who's coming to you with their direct experience on this issue, with their lived experience, and is also very much so informed about the data, about what's impacting not just them, but their community. And so there's so much work that really was driven by the data and the direct experience of young people, and that was another sort of strategy and lane and avenue that we took up. But also, like I said before, COVID-19 was very real. The experience was very daunting for a lot of young people, specifically those directly impacted by the, quite frankly, violence that was happening in these facilities. And so we were able to just leverage those stories, those experiences, and the data that was coming out of these facilities as a way to lead decarceration efforts across the state of New York, really tapping into the fact that young people needed to be released because we cannot afford, as a city, as a state, as a people, to have young people dying in these facilities because there's no preventative measures being taken around COVID-19. And so there was many sort of success stories, specifically internally, the leadership, the cultivation of leadership amongst young people who are now actively organizing in their own right and respect across the city and state. But more specifically, there was a reduction in incarceration of young people in the city of New York, large in part because of COVID, but the numbers were reduced. And so I think ultimately what we're looking at is decarceration. What we're looking at is a world where young people are no longer incarcerated, and it has to start somewhere. And we're proud of what we were able to accomplish here in New York, even amidst the pandemic, and really more so proud of the young people and the efforts that they're leading that we know will live out for the next years to come. I'm really pushing for a lot of these policy measures that will decarcerate in a much more broader stroke.
Yeah, I love that. I think we're all here for a world where there's young people served in their communities and not in prisons. Malik, do you want to share a little bit about what worked and what is working in Pennsylvania?
I can speak on that. So my name is Mom with the Art and Self-Empowerment Project. So effective strategies that we did, we center in youth voice and their experiences, knowledge in our decision making. Like anything decisions we made, we always try to center put the youth in it.
I think we lost you there for a second, but we heard a lot of that, Mai. Thank you for piping in. This is the audio on my end.
Hey, Allison, this is Courtney. I accidentally muted you, Mai. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, we're all back.
All right.
Tell us what you think.
All right, so partnering with local organizations doing similar work to strengthen numbers, developing relationships with task force members, to get information that otherwise would have just been kept a secret. So we had tried to get youth to share the stories with the task force members. Like, for instance, I did too. I shared my story on when I was incarcerated, and when they had meetings to hear stories, they can come up with recommendations. So the task force members, it was coming up with recommendations, and we was trying to share stories from the youth to help them with those recommendations. And it didn't go well the first time because not all youths were able to finish the testimony, including myself. I didn't get to finish mine. So and we was getting cut off, and we wasn't able to get on camera. So we decided to do our own little meeting, and we invited the task force members and council members, people, and everybody invited. So instead of us coming to their meeting, we invited them to our meeting, and they're gonna sit and listen to us while we share our stories. So that's what we had came up with, and it was challenging at first, but we made sure we got the task force members to listen to the youth and lift up their voices.
Thank you, Mai. Yeah, I agree that one of the most powerful things that I've seen over the last year is really sort of you guys in Pennsylvania flipping the roles, right? And saying, it's not on us to show up to your meeting, it's on you to show up to ours, because we're the folks who are bearing the brunt of the system and we know what we need. So it's been really incredible to watch, and appreciate you sharing those strategies with folks on the ground. So thank you. I know that folks are sort of already starting to think about this, because it's hard to think about what works without thinking about some of the roadblocks that you encountered and the lessons learned. So I'll rephrase it just a little bit, so that if you could talk a little bit, one, about like what did you encounter that were barriers to the work and to the decarceration work, but also, what lessons did you take away from this past year that we can leverage moving forward as we push to make sure that there are no kids behind bars? So again, we'll start with you, Taz, in Maryland.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things, working with young folks who have been introduced into Maryland's legal system, we of course have the barriers that come with folks not being able to get jobs that they need to take care of themselves, being able to literally just take care of themselves and their families. And so I think that was a general barrier that we had that, of course, was magnified throughout the pandemic. I think, though, because of the pandemic and sort of all of these unexpected things, that we really allowed each other to move at the speed of like need and trust. And so I think that lesson from like COVID, again, is like moving slow, right? That we have to be intentional about the things that we are doing, including with like how we are building relationship with each other. I think another sort of unexpected barrier related to COVID is really just the grief that we were feeling, whether it's from the failures of the health system related to COVID-19, or just because the health system was in shambles, that folks were losing folks or having folks in the hospitals for minor things. And so those were, again, some like unexpected roadblocks. And the lesson learned from that really was being able to be there for each other, even for folks who were new folks, right? We were still being able to learn from each other, be there for each other, and support each other. And I really think that this work that we've been doing over this last year really is, again, like creating this foundation for the advocacy work that we'll be able to do as things are opening up, as things are shifting, as more folks are, again, like getting word of 24 None. I think that lesson really is, really like moving at the speed of trust, moving at the speed of need, and being able to be there for each other. And so hopefully we'll be able to, like, again, use that foundation as we're moving on, growing our base with folks, getting more folks who are interested in being organizers. And when we get to the really tough places of like seeing these stakeholders and decision makers like all the time, right? That we'll have that family aspect, that we'll have that relationship that we've built. And so I think the biggest lesson has really been relationship building for us, and being able for that to ground us.
Thank you. Yeah, when you said grief was a roadblock, that really hit home for me, and I'm sure for a lot of other folks in the work. So thank you for elevating that and sharing sort of the intentional focus on relationship building, which really is the core to this work. Don, do you want to share a little bit about what the roadblocks were in North Carolina? Lessons learned there?
You would think I would be better. We would all be better at navigating Zoom after all this time of being on Zoom. Roadblocks, I think, are, like I said, North Carolina is, the political landscape in North Carolina is especially difficult to penetrate with progressive ideas, especially ideas around advancing issues around children. We have, so the roadblocks that we've had have been the kind of political tribalism that we see and the politicalization of everything, even things that nonsensically should not be political. For example, one of the things that we are very actively engaged in is a piece of legislation that's pending right now to raise the age of adjudication from 6 in North Carolina up till 10, which is clearly not high enough. It should be much higher, but that's a different conversation. But one of the biggest roadblocks that we're having is just the political theater of Republicans and even some Democrats, for that matter, who are six. The political theater of responding to the demands of the people for criminal justice reform, but also trying to do that in a way that is as racist as possible, which is what we're seeing manifest itself a lot with legislation here in North Carolina that's pending, especially with this one that we have pending where we're trying to raise it from 6 to 10. So even though that sounds good, then there's this poison pill inside of that piece of legislation that makes it mandatory for children's parents, for 6 to 10-year-old parents to be brought under the jurisdiction of the court so that they can be within the jurisdiction of the court and become part of the penal system and the carceral system in order to manage and offer services to their children. So while it is taking 6-year-olds out of the system, for example, I mean, technically, it's replacing that pound of flesh with bringing criminal jurisdiction over their parents. So we have a long way to go in North Carolina as it relates to breaking down the political tribalism and getting some real common sense legislation moved forward. But we just cannot do that with the General Assembly that we have right now. Oh, what legislation is that? I want to tell you the number, and it just flew out of my head. I want to say 264, but let me look it up again, and I'll come back to y'all. But that is one of our biggest hurdles. It is just the lack of genuine desire by our political actors to really create change. They want to create political theater, but not so much real substantive change.
Thanks. Yeah. And the other things I heard in terms of, aside from the political theater that you mentioned, is really this issue of how racist our system is, right? And how even as we've begun decarceration efforts, in some places there have been successful efforts in bringing kids of color home, but in other places, the decarceration and the disparities have only increased. And so I just wanted to echo sort of what I heard you say there as well. And also the tremendous work in terms of trying to create a minimum age of prosecution that is not 6, which is incredible. So I think next we have you, Malika, in Minnesota.
Yes. I just really empathize with, everybody who's experiencing very similar challenges in the states that they're working in. I will say, in addition to what other folks have shared, working virtually this year has been challenging. It's been challenging in ways that I think our coalitions have been previously made decisions in person. Learning how to do that in a virtual setting has been just different. Though I think the virtual setting has allowed us to have some more access to system stakeholders than we might have had previously, and certainly allowed for young people to have maybe more easy access to system stakeholders than having to get down to our legislature or to find time in the schedule of our Deputy Commissioner of Corrections. I'll say another challenge in this year, kind of related to what Taz was sharing about the emotional exhaustion of the pandemic. I think at some point our media wasn't talking about the pandemic anymore. And so, in October and November and December, it was hard to continue to elevate the concern about kids who remained in facilities. And so we really tried to and leaned into the voices of young people and families and uplifting their specific stories during those periods when it felt like nobody was covering this issue that we felt really passionately about. And then finally, being in Minneapolis in the last year, I think So many members of our communities, so many Black, Indigenous, and youth of color in our communities have been on the streets fighting for justice and reform to our policing system. And so while there are overlapping issues, it has been, challenging. Our communities, our activist communities, and our youth have experienced a lot of exhaustion. And so trying to center again the ideas of decarceration and connect those to movements towards police reform or abolition has just been work. But I think that it has also activated a lot of youth energy and a lot of young people who maybe before had never attended a protest were leading protests this summer. And so we've really had a fun and good challenge of finding emerging youth leaders, finding young people who previously were nervous and just walking with them on the streets and then elevating their leadership gradually. And so that's been a cool challenge to wrestle with. And I think it'll be an interesting one for our community moving forward. With sentencing for Derek Chauvin coming up in a couple of weeks, the other 3 officers on trial next year, how people are going to be able to maintain the same level of activism. I am curious about, but then, we have police involved shooting last week in our community, and people have been out every single night. So it's a good reminder for me to never discount the energy of people fighting for justice.
Well, I have goosebumps and can only echo what Taz said, in that we are sending our love to you in Minnesota and all the organizers on the ground there. Lisa in New York City, what do you have to add? Lots of things, I'm sure.
I honestly feel like folks said so much, and I echo what everyone has already shared, especially what Dawn shared with folks who sort of want to public facingly be something, but behind closed doors not actually represent what they're articulating in the media or in the public or to their constituents. I think at its core, a lot of the roadblocks stemmed from the pressure of having to rapidly respond to issues as they happened while being in the middle of a COVID-19 crisis, right? And so we couldn't just pull up to the state capitol. We couldn't just organize a protest and be on the streets. We had to think about, we need masks, we need temperature checks, we need to think more strategically about how to protect people, especially young people who already come from communities that we know are devastated and ravished by COVID-19. And so not wanting to put people who are already impacted in so many different ways in a predicament where they also have to be concerned about their health. I think that was a large sort of roadblock that I'm sure so many partners had to think about, strategically wanting to sort of be present and have public spacing activity, but also having to considerably think about how we do those things virtually, or how we do those things considering COVID, among so many other things. And I think at its core, the lessons that were learned is that we have to be adaptable. We have to be able to shift. We have to be able to strategize on our toes. And I think young people do that phenomenally, like so many other people shared. As I sort of think about what work needs to be done moving forward, so much of it has already started. So much of it really is in the hands of young people who are already actively on the streets, talking to their representatives, pushing policy forward, and so many other things. And as we think about sort of the decarceration on a larger scale, there's a lot of policy initiatives that can be driven, and young people really having the space and the capacity and the expertise to do so is important, and it's what we hope to continue to provide young people across New York City. I'm thinking specifically about experiences that arose this past year with young people who were actively on the front lines and contracted COVID-19, and that disrupted so much of how we address the work, right? Experiences with young people who really were wanting to be strategic about how they talk about their experiences, how they talk about their stories, but weren't received as they should have by legislators and policymakers. And I think at its core, as I even think about like the data that came out as decarceration efforts happened across New York City specifically, Black young people were left behind, right? When we think about who was released, the numbers that came out after the reporting and the data and the coverage that there was, because it was minimal, but the ones that did come out, it really is a reminder that not just New York, but really our country has to come to its heels and reckon with the fact that we have racial injustice in every inch of every system that America is a part of, right? And so it starts with the hospitals and the treatments of how young people are treated, and really even the entrance of how folks show up into schools with police presence to their communities, how communities are over policed, and our police departments are really mini militaries on our streets, not serving the people, rather serving the quote unquote powers that be. And so really just understanding that as we do this work moving forward, it needs to be at its crux, racial justice centered. It needs to be centering Black young people. It needs to be at the advancement of young people of color, because they're always the ones being left behind. Even as we see decarceration happen, the numbers can reduce by 75%. And the 25% that are remaining typically are upwards 75% Black young people. And so that's a reality that we have to face. And I think here in New York, it's a lesson that we've known, but one that we're continuing to learn on how we can continue to center everything that we do around racial justice, because what we know is that if we don't, young people of color are going to be left behind.
Yeah, I think we've seen that all over the country, and appreciate you elevating that. I don't know who from the Pennsylvania group wants to chime in here, but I'll open the space for whoever wants to share.
Thanks, Allison. So I'll just echo that, we experienced some of the same barriers that a lot of the other organizations did, but a couple of things that were unique to Pennsylvania was that there was a lack of meaningful youth participation in the decarceration conversation, and that kind of stifled the conversation about the impact of COVID-19 on youth that were in carceral settings. This was particularly prevalent with the task force process, because as it was originally designed, it seemed to be a process that was mainly just for stakeholders, and then the technical assistance agency, the Pew Charitable Trust, to kind of just have conversations, and it was kind of designed to be devoid of comment and participation from youth and families in the communities who are the true experts on these issues and kind of know what reforms need to be made to the system. There was also a lack of advocate and stakeholder input within the task force process. We kind of really had to fight to kind of bring youth to the table and to remind the task force members and also Pew that these are the true experts and that they need to have a seat. And there was also a lack of transparency within the task force process. A lot of decisions and conversations were kind of made in secret, and they weren't announced, and decisions were not announced to the public until much later after they had been decided. And that's kind of where, as Mai mentioned, like the partnerships that we developed came in handy, because we were really able to become friendly with a lot of task force members who kind of kept us in the loop about what was going on and decisions that were coming down the pike. And so another related struggle was that because there was a lack of transparency, there was often a very tight timeline for us to become involved and for us to advocate for certain issues related to the task force process. So that kind of forced us to be very reactive in our advocacy strategies, because we were often tasked with like a late night email saying, oh, hey, can you guys prepare something to testify to task force members next week? Or can you guys put letters together to comment on the task force recommendations? But we need them to go out next week. So there was always a lot of last minute things that didn't allow us to be as proactive as we would have liked in our advocacy strategies. So those were some of the main roadblocks that we encountered.
Yeah, I think that's real in terms of just time and advanced warning in terms of being able to really influence the conversation. So I recognize we're running low on time, and a lot of folks have sort of already answered this in your previous responses, because as all good organizers and advocates, you guys are already thinking about what's next and how to continue to move the ball. So I'll just open this up broadly and sort of to everyone or all our panelists to sort of share what's next for you all. So I'm not going to call you in state order. I'm just going to sort of let folks who have something to say pop in. And for those who are attendees, if you want to add questions to the chat box, sort of do two things at once. Let's give it a shot.
I'll jump in here with some next steps from Maryland. We are definitely planning to do some more political education over these next few months. That really allows us to deepen our analysis and continue to inform that advocacy work that we are doing and plan to continue to do. Our young folks have already determined that they want to meet with stakeholders from the Department of Juvenile Services, Social Services, heads from the prisons, and just different stakeholders that they're like, we have something to say, we want y'all to listen. So hopefully that will be coming up soon. We want to continue to grow our base of folks, both folks who just look to us as the youth who are making decisions for ourselves, and for the folks who want to become organizers. And then lastly, really wanting to be intentional about highlighting the stories of folks who are still incarcerated, girls and young women, and gender variant folks who really oftentimes are also left out of these conversations, especially in a system that is trying to erase and kill all. And so I think those are the next steps for Maryland, and again, really trying to grow our base in reaching our people.
One quick thing, I'll jump in from Minnesota. We're thinking a lot about, again, as I mentioned before, how to prevent the system from just returning back to normal. In our community here too, we were experiencing an increase in gun violence and youth-related homicides, which was a trend from last summer and I think is a national trend, but we're hearing and feeling system pressure around, all right, the pandemic is over, there's violence in our streets, we got to get kids back in facilities. So we're really trying to pump the brakes on that. As well as, really trying to continue to think about the American Rescue Plan and a lot of federal funding that will be coming to the states and coming to our state, and how we can use this opportunity for infrastructure building to invest that money in communities as opposed to corrections. And so would love to learn from other folks too on this call who are thinking about how do we make the most of these resources that'll be coming our ways to make sure that they're going in the right places to support youth as we want it to.
Yeah, I'll jump in here as well. One, I think I want to mention just as a resource to folks on the call. I mentioned this, I think, at another briefing with the other co-grantees, but the Gathering for Justice right now is looking at supporting young people in New York and California who have recently been released from a facility. And so if you all know anyone, encourage them to apply to our Community Relief Fund. We're providing one-time grants to young people in need. We're also supporting activists, specifically girls and gender expansive young folks who are on the front lines of this work around the country. And so that's another fund that's open to supporting young people in need. But I think as we think about strategically how we want to work, we're taking a strong approach on probation and parole in the next year. Specifically looking at targeting these systems that we know have failed young people. Propped up as alternatives to incarceration, we know that these systems have turned into what's really fueling incarceration the most. And so really wanting to analyze and look at policy on a federal level and on a statewide level here in New York that's going to allow young people to have program officers and probation officers who will specifically center them in their needs, right? We want these folks acting as coaches, not referees. We want young people to feel encouraged to complete college, to complete courses, to take on their workforce opportunities, to not land back in a jail, prison, or detention center. And so as we think about how to sort of strategically move these systems and reform these systems, we're looking at policies that provide incentives for decarceration, right? What we know is that these systems thrive and continue to receive funding for having these large caseloads of young people who are lingering in these systems and oftentimes falling into the trap of ending back in detention. And so what does it look like to provide incentives to systems that actually have lower caseloads, that young people, have success stories of young people who made it off of probation, made it off of parole, who were transitioned into a life of success. And so really working with reentry organizations and building up campaigns and really a solid coalition of folks who are working towards this. And I'll end with this. In New York City, we have elections coming up. And so young people are avidly organizing. What we know is that this is one of the most critical elections and is rendering of the freedom of a lot of young people, specifically as we think about the fact that Rikers, Close Rikers campaign is still lingering. There's legislation right now that pushes Rikers to close down by 2025, but they're looking at building 4 other community jails, which can house way more people than Rikers has. And so what we know is that when there's the presence of detention centers or facilities that can house people, the state does what it can to fill up these facilities. And so we don't want that to be the case. And so actively looking at presenting issues and pushing these issues, having young people organize strategically around how they can get whoever is the next candidate, whoever makes it to the ballot, to advance what young people see as priority here in New York City.
I can jump in really quickly. A couple of things that we're going to be working on in the near future is that we'll be engaging in a continued advocacy with the legislature. We know that the task force process is wrapping up, and the final report is due to be released that will contain the recommendations that the task force is supporting. And so the next step will be for that report to be taken to the legislature, and then it'll go through the legislative process. So we're planning to be active within that process. We're going to be producing written documents. I'm going to be trying to get individual meetings with different legislators to talk about the recommendations and to advocate for them being introduced. And then we're also going to be continuing to build the Carry Not Control Coalition and to include more partners. So those are kind of the big things we'll be working on.
Thanks, everyone. I don't know, Don, if you want to add anything to North Carolina in our last minute. But I will just add, so we, go ahead, sorry, Don, I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say, I actually don't have anything to add. This has really been a robust conversation. And I feel like for one state, I've taken up a lot of space on this call. So I'm just really excited about the work that everybody's doing.
Agreed. I think there's a lot of momentum. And obviously, as everyone elevated, the system always finds a way to put youth behind bars. And so the efforts have to continue to make sure that we transform the system and make sure we take down the sort of racist pillars that it's built on. So I know we had initially planned for questions and answers. I know that we're at time, but if anyone has questions, please feel free to email info@njjn.org, and we'll make sure to get those questions answered from panelists and get it back to you. But we really appreciate you all joining us for this conversation, and a huge thank you to all of our activists and organizers who are panelists on today's calls. You guys are awesome, and it's been really inspiring to watch your work over the past year, and look forward to seeing everything that you guys continue to move going forward. So thank you all, and we'll be in conversation as the work continues.